Assalamu alaikum class. My sincere wishes and prayers to all of you. I wish that you all are doing well, and I haven't seen you for ages, but you are very close to me, very good class as well. I'm here, your instructor, once again with a new lecture that is very, very key, and you may come into your exams as well. I'm your instructor Asim, and hopefully this lecture will go well. And keep posted me your suggestion if you find any difficulty or something that you have a question in this question on. So our topic for today's presentation, Alexander Pope. He was born in 1688 and died in 1744. So we want everybody to learn and understand this topic carefully. I'm telling you again and again that just read this carefully and understand it carefully. So Alexander Pope was born in London on May 21, 1688, disadvantaged from the start by being born into a Roman Catholic family at a time when Catholics were severely restricted in their liberties and properties by the English government. Beard from an English university, education by his religion, he nevertheless received some schooling at a couple of Catholic institutions, but soon supplemented this with his own extensive reading in Greek and Latin authors, and later on he began writing verse by doing translation of these authors and imitation by adaptations of others such as Chaucer, Waller, and Cowley. Early life of Alexander. Born on May 21, 1688, born in Lombard Street, London. Parents Alexander Pope Sr., Edith Turner. Both his parents were Roman Catholic. Before he was 12, he had obtained a smattering of Latin and Greek from various masters, from a priest in Hampshire, from a schoolmaster at Walford near Winchester, from Thomas Jane, who kept a school in Marylebone, and afterwards at Harry Park Corner, and finally from another priest at home. So Pope is by far the most important poetic figure of the age called after him, 1700 to 1740. His importance lies in the fact that he exercised the greatest influence of the classical poetry of the century. His poetry was intellectual, didactic, and satiric, and was almost written heroic couplet. It is never of the highest class, but within its limit, it stands unrevealed in the language. There is a little bit of introduction and about the early life of Alexander Pope. Was an 18th century English poet. Best known for his satirical verse, he is the third most frequently quoted writer in the Oxford Dictionary of Quotations after Shakespeare and Tennyson. Famous for his use of the heroic couplet, Pope was born in Alexander Pope Sr. and his wife Edith Turner. Pope was taught to read by his aunt and went to Twyford School in about 1698 or 1699. So he was a pseudo-classicist. The true classicism is meant to be a combination of poetic ardor and excellence of form. In Pope, the true poetic ardor and energy is absent, but he is exceedingly careful about the technique of form and style. When we look at the contents of Pope's poetry, we do not find anything worthwhile. Style, didactic poetry, and a flimsy mock heroic poem are all his poetic achievements. They are mere products of intellect and artificially constructed. They do not produce true classical spirit. Hence, it is not correct to describe Pope as a true classicist. Milton, with his poetic impulse and perfection of form, is a true classicist. The classicism of Pope is the shadow of classicism. It is false or pseudo classicism. Further, at the age of 12, he suffered numerous health problems such as Pott's disease. In May 1700, Pope's pastoral was published in the 16th parts of Townsend's Poetical Masculinity and was followed by an essay on criticism published in May 1711. He made friends with Tory writers John Gay, Jonathan Swift, Thomas Farnham, and John Arbuthnot, who together formed the Satirical Circular Club. An essay on criticism was the first published anonymously on 15 May 1711. At the time the poem was published, the heroic couplet style in which it was written was a moderately new genre of poetry. Final section of an essay on criticism discusses the moral qualities and virtues inherent in the ideal critic, who Pope claims is also the ideal man. Pope was an intellectual. His poetry was intellectual poetry. Pope's poetry was of his age and it reflected in full measure the spirit of age. It is intellectual and its appeal is to mind rather than to the heart. It is full of wit and epigram, the brilliancy of which is unsurpassed. Pope is next to Shakespeare in contributing quotable lines or verse, which are remarkable for their pregnancy, neatness, and brevity. Here are some of his famous quotes. To err is human, to forgive divine. And the next is, never elated when someone's oppressed, never dejected when another one's blessed. And next famous quote of Pope is, we think our fathers fools, so wise we grow. Our wiser sons, no doubt, will think us so. For fools, fresh in where angels fear to tread. These are the famous quotes of Alexander Pope. Words of Alexander. Essay on criticism was first published anonymously on May 15, 1711. Pope began writing to poem early in his career and took about 3 years to finish it. And the next, the famous work of Alexander Pope is Rape of the Lock, which we'll study in the next lecture, and it is a very important one. And Pope's most famous poem, first published in 1712. with a revised version published in 1714. Essay on Man is a philosophical poem written in heroic couplets and published between 1732 and 1734. Pope intended this poem to be the centerpiece of a proposed system of ethics that was to be put forth in poetic form. It was a piece of work that Pope intended to make into a larger work. However, he did not live to complete it. The Rape of the Lock as a Social Style. This poem shows Pope's genius for satirical poetry, which exposes in a witty manner that follies and absurdities of the high society of the time. All the recognized weapons of style have been employed by Pope in a most effective manner. The principal targets of style is this poem are aristocratic ladies and gentlemen of Pope's day. Ladies who learn to roll their eyes and to blush in a coquettish manner. Pope ridicules the fickleness and superficiality of the ladies by referring to their hearts as moving toy shops and their verifying vanities. Pope was an 18th century English poet, best known for his satirical verse and for his translation of humor. He is the third most frequently quoted writer in the Oxford Dictionary of Quotation after William Shakespeare and Alfred Tennyson. An essay on criticism is one of the first major poems written by Pope. Despite the title, the poem is not as much an original analysis as it is compilation of Pope's reading of different ancients. It is the only significant critical treatise in English written in verse. It is famous for its polished lines, many of which have become proverbial. To err is human, to forgive is divine, is a famous quote of Pope's. Um, the Pope was a witty and fancy poet. Pope's subjects of poetry in which he excelled are of the satirical and mock heroic kind. He is the unchallenged master of artificial poetry, a poetry dealing with artificial life, and in this sphere the Rape of the Lock stands unmatched. Among the great English poets who had preceded Pope, Chaucer was a painter of actual life, Spenser of imaginative life, Shakespeare of ideal life, and Milton of moral and spiritual life. It remained for Pope to give rhythmically utterances to artificial life. He was eminently fitted for this task because he was gifted with the power of intellectual expression and perfect property of phrase. It is true that Pope had not much to express. He had hardly any original thing to say. His thoughts are mostly borrowed or commonplaces, but what gives distinction to his poetry is its lucid. His aim was to set the gems, not to create them. Lessing said, Pope's great merit lay in what we call the mechanic of poetry. The key term in Pope's essay is nature. It is not nature as the romantics were to understand it, wild and mysterious, but something reflecting deep order, moderation, universal laws. According to Pope, past percept, and the past examples are to be respected not simply for their antiquity, but because they enshrine natural law. In his create in his treatise, Pope offers a history of literary criticism. The great critics of the classical past had mortuoris nature, suppressed license, and brought a golden age. So here are some of the poet heroic couplet. Pope is the unchallenged master of the heroic couplet, just as Milton of the blank verse. Almost all the Pope's poetry is written in the heroic couplet. The rhythm of Pope's couplet has perfect smoothness and regularity, which have pleasing effect upon the ear. Pope mostly used the stops couplet, that is, there is a final pause after every couplet. One couplet does not follow into the next couplet. Carrying on its sense, this kind of couplet limits the scope of the poet, for he has to cut his thoughts to the size of the couplet. But Pope was the master of not the victim of the heroic couplet. He condensed his thoughts to precisely and choose his words so aptly that he could express his complete thought within the range of two lines. It is written in a type of rhyming verse called heroic couplet. It is a verse essay primarily concerned with how writers and critics behave in the new literary commerce of Pope's contemporaries. The poem covers a range of good criticism and advice. It also represents many of the chief literary ideals of Pope's age. The poem was said to be a response to an ongoing debate on the question of whether poetry should be natural or written according to predetermined artificial rules inherited from the classical past. Pope was a classic in prose. Matthew Arnold has called Pope as a classic in prose. It looks like a paradox, since Pope was a poet and not a prose writer. What Arnold means to say is that Pope's poetical style has all those qualities which gives distinction to prose. For example, lucidity, balance, imagination, warmth, wit, clearance, and logic, etc., but is wanting in that moving and transporting quality which is the hallmark of true poetry. Lowell said, measured by any high standard of imagination, he will be found wanting; tried by any test of wit, he is unreviled. He discusses the laws in which a critic should adhere while critiquing poetry and poets out. The critics bear an important function in aiding poets with their works as opposed to the practice of attacking them. The final section of an essay on criticism discusses the moral qualities and virtues inherent in the ideal critic, who Pope claims is also the ideal man as a tool to make the argument that property only conveys a separate reality, but that it has a long venerable history and it does not lie. It is defensible in its own right as a mean to move readers to virtuous action. Next is the main style of his heroic style, heroic couplet, conformed to pentameter from Stickley. His poetry strove for a perfect balance between thought and technique and style. Rape of the Lock, Dionys's Epigram is a true example of style. They are are some limitation of the pop's poetry as well. Pop's poetry is not only superficial but is limited to its range. Firstly, it is the poetry of society in the city, as in the Rape of the Lock, a poetry of style, and the philosophic poetry which is dry and has no warmth of experience. Next is thank you very much, and there are some limitations that I would like to express before going off. And pop's poetry is not only superficial but is limited to its range. Firstly, it is the poetry of society in city, as the Rape of the Lock, a poetry of style, and the philosophic poetry, which is dry and has no warmth or experience behind it. Pope said the proper study of mankind is man, but it was mankind as seen only in the small society of London. Sportford Brook tried to rematches that vast range of humanity before London was left without sympathy, as if it did not exist. This was not only insular, it was insolent. So far as Pope's versification is concerned, it was limited to the heroic couplet, though he handled this measure with masterly skill. It shows mechanical skill rather than genuine art. So thank you very much, class.